When I think about the abundance agenda, I think there is no issue more tangible and perhaps more contentious than housing policy. So I'm very much looking forward to this next session. Moderating the session will be Chad Maisel. Chad has spent the vast majority of his professional career in public service, on the Hill, and serving in two administrations in the White House. Chad and I were colleagues and worked together on consumer protection. And most recently, he was a White House point for housing policy. So he is the perfect person to moderate this session. So thank you, Chad, for putting together what I think promises to be a great third panel of the day.
We're at the tail end of the day, so we're going to bring the energy. This is going to be a tight, excellent panel, and just thrilled to be here with this esteemed crew. So I'll do quick introductions, and then we're just going to dive right in. We have Tia Boatman Patterson, my lovely former colleague at the White House at OMB, who she's now president and CEO of the California Community Reinvestment Corporation, CDFI, here in California. We have Chris Elmendorf, who's the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis. We have Salim Firth, who's is a Senior Research Fellow and Director of the Urbanity Project at the Mercatus Center. And we have Senator Scott Wiener, who is a state senator here in California representing the 11th District. Great. Okay, so this topic, how do we build more housing, is so important and so timely. Rents over the last 5 years or so since the start of the pandemic have increased 30, 40, 50% or even more in some places. When it comes to home ownership, kind of the dream of owning their own home is increasingly feeling out of reach for many people. Homelessness, up 30% in the last 2 years alone nationally. So, all stemming from really the same source. They're really manifestations of the lack of housing across the country. So when it comes to increased rent, lack of home ownership opportunities, homelessness, I think even if we can solve one or even two of those issues on today's panel, I think we'll see it as a success. Okay, so let's dive right in. Chris, you're going to set the table for us. You're going to tell us, what does the research say about our housing supply gap and what it means for affordability across the country?
Okay, so very big picture. There are a bunch of people who've gone out and tried to estimate the housing gap or the housing deficit. They come up with numbers anywhere from 2 million missing homes to 20 million missing homes nationally. To my mind, those numbers aren't actually very helpful. And in fact, the housing gap framework isn't really helpful for thinking about the problem, because the problem is not like how many houses do we need? The problem is, can people live where they want to live? And what we are seeing, if you look at estimates that economists have tried to generate of what they call supply elasticities, which is how much does housing supply in local areas respond to changes in demand, is that those elasticities are declining decade by decade. In other words, it's getting harder and harder and harder to add housing almost everywhere. It's not just a superstar city problem, it's an everywhere problem. At the same time, and maybe related to this, as Derek commented on the first panel, productivity in the construction industry has been flat, maybe even declining over the last 15 years. And if the construction industry isn't generating new, more efficient ways to build homes, well, maybe it's no surprise that it's getting harder to add homes to the housing stock as well. If you drill down and look at estimates of supply elasticities within small geographic areas and also where housing was added to metro areas' housing stock over the last 30 or 40 years, the basic pattern is that in outlying areas where there's still a lot of undeveloped land, those places used to be places where housing would be added when there was an increase in demand. And as those places have been built up and they start to look more suburban, they lose their elasticity, right? They get rigid. And in fact, going back to 1980, if you just subset to neighborhoods that were already built up as residential neighborhoods in 1980, the net increase in the stock of housing between 1980 and 2020 is approximately zero. In other words, there have been some new homes built, and they've offset the homes that were demolished, and we're seeing no new increase in the stock of housing in the aggregate. It's the greenfield outlying areas where we've added about 80% of the new housing, and then some redevelopment in urban cores and industrial areas. So that's the big picture. It's not a very hope-inspiring big picture. Within that big picture, there are little maybe sparks of hope that other members of the panel will talk about, but that's, I think, enough to set the stage.
Okay, before we get into the sparks of hope, I'm going to keep you all waiting on that. So let's just kind of, again, setting the table, kind of what the impediments are, right? You kind of zoomed out and what the big picture, what the data suggests. But what are the big barriers, the big impediments that you see that are preventing us from building more housing? Tia, why don't we start with you?
Well, when you think about how we go about financing particularly affordable housing, and then you think about how you build residential housing, it doesn't always match. The federal government, unless they're building public housing, does not build housing. State of California, unless it's building public housing, does not build housing. But those are where a lot of the resources come from to support housing from the public sector. And I think one of our biggest impediments is that we have local government who is approving the housing, but they're not the biggest resources contributing to specifically affordable housing. And so how do you align your resources and the role of state or federal government and housing policy? What is their role? And how do they incentivize or give hope to those local jurisdictions or give them political cover so that they will approve more housing? And I think aligning that, we've tried with different places, but I want to say that's, to me, one of the biggest barriers, is that the people who are approving the housing aren't the ones necessary with the resources.
Salim?
It's a great question. There are so many different things, and
my
part of the reason that this has become a national conversation is that it's not just zoning, it's now construction materials cost and labor shortages. I think the thing that I would point to, and this is not going to be news to many people here, is the permitting process and the kind of permission slip, multiple veto point process that most significantly sized housing projects in most urban jurisdictions have to go through. And I think this is actually something I was thinking of listening to some of the earlier panels today about a lot of like, what do we as a society want and what are we as a government going to do? And I think it's really important to start distinguishing between what government does, where there's then input not only into is the government hurting someone who's in its way, but also is this what we who are represented by this government actually want the government to do? Do we want a new highway or not, regardless of whether it displaces something else? When people are building on private land, it's not the government. There isn't the same we. There's still the same concern if they're hurting someone around them. But we shouldn't be applying the standards of, hey, what is this representative government going to do as a government? We shouldn't be applying those standards to this person wants to tear down their house and build a sixplex, right? And that's a completely different activity, and it really gets muddied with the we language. And sometimes it's just like, it's I and thou, and these are different people.
Agreed.
Great point.
Great. Hi, everyone. In terms of the barriers, I think there are public barriers and private barriers. I will, starting on the private side, and I'm not a developer, I don't do real estate finance, I don't pretend to be an expert on it, but I, as a policymaker, have been observing it for a long time. And I think the industry is, a lot of the industry is still stuck in the way it was 80 or 100 years ago. It's an industry that until recently had not changed very much at all, and the world has changed. And so there have been changes recently in terms of like modular or other kinds of newer technologies, use of cross-laminated timber, which had been illegal in California until about 5 years ago. And so there have been some changes, but those even like with modular, and there are different views about modular, but even modular, it's not at scale. It's not even remotely at scale. It's interesting, I don't know if anyone read the new book by Chris Hughes, Market Crafters. I'm actually interviewing him tonight on stage at the Commonwealth Club. I'm looking forward to asking him about housing because I feel like the government needs to step in and make a better market on housing and help the private sector. Public sector involvement is incredibly important, and I think your point is a really important one. The federal government, the state, needs to get back more directly involved in terms of what social housing we're calling it now. But I think we need to find ways to make the private sector housing development world work better. It is so boom bust. I've seen very few industries that are as boom bust. And even situations like if rents go down, maybe I want to build less. There's just a lot of messiness in the industry. On the public side, it's sometimes, and we hear this sometimes, okay, we've done zoning, or we've done this, or we've done that, and we need to move beyond it. We actually have not. Let's be very, very clear. Yes, we have finally made our ADU law work that was passed in the early 1980s and was a dead letter. And then it took about 5-6 years to close all the loopholes in it, and now it's finally working. But it took time. We are finally forcing cities to zone for more density, but through the housing element and regional housing needs allocation. But that's just happening now. Sometimes people hear stuff in the news so much that they're like, oh, that happened a long time ago and it's not working. It's like, no, it's happening now. San Francisco is doing its rezoning for its housing element now. The mayor just rolled it out. It's going to presumably be passed by the Board of Supervisors by September or October. So a lot of these things have not really played out. We passed our duplex law, SB 9, 4 or 5 years ago, and there were problems with that law that make it so that it is very rarely used. We're trying to fix it now. We have other, our SB 35, a streamlining law that I authored in 2017, which was becoming very productive for below market rate subsidized housing, but not for market rate. Well, we made a change to it a year and a half ago, and that is just starting to. So these things they play out over periods of years and years. And so sometimes we hear, oh, you passed this housing law and it's 2 years later and we don't have 10 million new homes. It takes time. And of course, the last 5 years between the pandemic and then super high interest rates and now the tariff war, it's like, I feel like for people in housing, it's like one body blow after the other. So the zoning is just playing out, and we have to continue to do that. It is still the case that around a lot of BART and Caltrain stations, it is zoned for single-family homes, which is one of the worst land use decisions you could possibly make. We're trying to change that this year. And permitting, we continue to try to accelerate that. And the last thing I want to say is we continue to allow cities, and I'm not criticizing cities for this, cities put huge impact fees on housing. It's a tax on housing. Mm-hmm. And they do that because we have made it in California so hard for cities to raise revenue mm-hmm. that the easiest way to do it is just to put fees on developers, which in theory may sound right, but it ends up adding, I don't know, $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 cost to every home. Mm-hmm. And so people wonder, why are you building such high-end housing? That's one of the reasons. And so we need to stop taxing something that we desperately need and making it easier and more affordable.
So, Senator Wiener, you talked about kind of the flurry of activity, happening in California and really kind of all over the country. You're going to hear, kind of passively receive information on what's going on in state capitals and, things that folks on the Hill are trying to do in Congress. And it is kind of hard to tell kind of what's work, given the lag, the tail on these things in terms of bearing fruit, like what works and what doesn't, what has promise and what's more of a show, I guess. And so, Salim, you travel around the country and you talk to state legislators and local leaders. Could you just kind of do a snapshot of some of the more interesting trends, things you're seeing, interventions that are being tried, and what's working and maybe what isn't?
Yeah, great question. So there's an enormous amount of activity. My team is tracking probably 600 plus state housing bills across the country this year. 70 have been signed into law or at least sent to a governor so far, including ADU reforms copying California's lessons over 40 years, hopefully speed running that in Arkansas, Maryland, Iowa. New Hampshire's probably coming. And another set of reforms that's been really popular the last few years, because it sort of met two constituencies, was allowing more residential development in commercial zones, right? So the pandemic really hurt office rents and office occupancy rates in a lot of markets. That's a slow-moving crisis because they're often on 10-year leases. So anybody who signed a lease 2019 or earlier, when they come to renew, a lot of them are saying, we just don't need this much space. So for another 5 years, we're still going to be sort of slow-rolling the office vacancy crisis. And that creates a new constituency in sort of downtown or suburban office park landowners who are like, this is a non-performing asset. I would really love to tear down the two-story office building and build housing, which is desperately needed. And a lot of cities are happy to allow this on their own, but they're usually really slow about it. And so they're kind of happy when their states step in and say, so Montana just did this, saying you can build up to 6 stories on any sort of heavy commercial site. And so 6 stories of residential, which is, by Montana standards, that's pretty high rise. Sure. But like the senator said, it takes a long time to know what's working. So I got to visit Edmonton and Calgary, which are not quite in this country, as Arnab told us. Edmonton's better, I'm sad to say. But yeah, so they're doing everything right, and they've got the receipts. So I would say they're doing greenfield growth correctly, building high quality neighborhoods, charging reasonable impact fees that make it, make sense, fiscal sense for the city, but aren't so high that they're jacking up prices too much. They're doing a ton of infill growth at all scales, tower to ADU. And they're working from a baseline that's a very average North American city, right? So it isn't the case that you have to have San Francisco prices or New Orleans history of land use patterns. You can take a pretty average North American city and do really good housing policy and get great results. So it is possible. It does take time, and you've got to get a lot of things lined up, right? Any one bottleneck can choke off production.
Yeah, and I guess I wonder, are good things are happening across the country, presumably, like what that exchange of information is like, right? Like everyone says, it's like, oh, our community is unique, our state, there's nothing like it, and like, I don't know if that really is true or not. Certainly there are learnings, that we can take from, and so I wonder, Salim, Chris, Tia, Senator Wiener, like where is there that, are we moving towards a world here in our country where states are all kind of moving in the same direction, learning from each other, or I'm sensing some good.
Tell us how you
looking
really
forward
feel.
to
Tell you how I really feel.
Yeah.
Senator Wiener might not like this, but California
Stir the pot. This is good.
Yeah, I'm going to stir the pot.
Yeah.
This is why they serve popcorn.
California, over the last 5 years, has passed over 150 pieces of housing legislation. They have gone from 400 staffers in the Department of Housing and Community Development to over 1,600 staffers. When do they have time to go talk to somebody? So we have put so much onto our Department of Housing and Community Development here in California, and they have done a fabulous job when it comes to zoning and housing element and some of their regulatory relief. But as a lender, I'm sitting at the closing table ready to close a loan. That interest rate is going to go up, and HCD is now telling me as a lender, yeah, I'll get to it in 3 weeks. Yeah, no, that doesn't work. And so when you start talking about talking to other people. Our Department of Housing and Community Development, what developers are they talking to? What lenders are they talking to? But then I have to feel sorry for them because I know they're trying to implement 150 pieces of legislation. That is just maddening. And so, no, we're not talking to the right people. We're not bringing the right people to the table. And we're not coordinating and collaborating in a way that I think we should be doing. California is not a one-size-fits-all state. And so visit those regions, talk to those communities, understand what their needs are. What are their employment bases? What are developers saying? I don't think we do enough talking to the people who actually build the housing.
I feel like it's like one of those presidential debates where if one of the candidates is named, they're able to respond.
I mean, and by the way, I know the governor is trying to consolidate housing, and we'll see how that goes. There's a lot of stuff that's in different departments that maybe shouldn't be, but so in terms, in terms of the number of housing bills, I mean that runs a vast gamut of subject matters, and a lot of those bills are very small, bills, or it could be bills that are cleaning up past laws. So I don't go very much by the number of bills. There's been a smaller number of, I think, really the big bills that really shift the paradigm. But HCD has been given a lot of responsibility, but a lot of that they really are, for the first time, enforcing. Used to be, we did housing elements. We've been doing housing elements for almost half a century. I was on the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco when we did our housing element the last cycle years ago. It was a joke. It was like super dramatic, everyone yelling and fighting about housing element for a very small amount of housing because that part was screwed up too. Cities were able to get really low numbers, and everyone would yell back and forth, and we would finally approve the housing element, and then it would just sit and collect dust on a shelf. And so and it did not take one bill. It probably took about, honestly, 10 or 15 bills to finally put full teeth into the housing element, because as much as we would love to do one, I don't want to say one big beautiful bill, because that one big solve-it-all bill, that's not the way the legislature rolls, unfortunately. So you do a series over years, and now the housing element has real teeth in it. It actually is enforceable, but and HCD has to enforce it. It's 500 cities and 58 counties who are submitting housing elements and having to go back and forth with HCD and have advocates yell at them, you're not being hardcore enough, you're being too hardcore. So we put a lot on HCD, but the enforcement has been, so much better. There was no enforcement before, and one of the things, Governor Newsom has been a champion on housing in many, many, many ways, and he's like very aligned with where we are. But he and the Attorney General, Rob Bonta, really ramped up enforcement, and that's fantastic.
So your question, I thought, was about communication between states, and it turned into communication within a state, but we can...
Let's
California's 3 or 4 states anyway. Think about it.
Salim, do you want to speak to communication between states? That's sort of your job, right?
I mean, people come to me and ask, like, hey, I heard about this thing happening in California. But don't do what California's doing. They're in a deeper hole than you. They need different tools than you. It's easier and it's simpler in most of the other states, not New York.
New York is way harder than California.
Yeah.
I feel.
In New York, they
I don't
can't
know
even
about
pass laws. But a lot of state legislatures are part-time. These are folks with day jobs. They come into the Capitol, sort of 60, 120 days a year. They have minimal, if any, staff, and even the committee staff are spread thin, right? They have to cover too many areas. So their ability to sort of study an issue and say, like, how do you write law is limited, and it's not their fault. So for folks like me and Chris and many advocates who work in their own individual states, it's enormously important to be able to find good legislative models, carry those over and say, hey, this state did a good job with a a residential and commercial zone bill. This other state, it was too vague. Don't copy them. And being able to sort of create those models and then export them. So a big hope in the red states this year is there's a really strong effort, actually by a Bay Area refugee who lives in Austin now, to get a major housing package through the Texas legislature, which is an absolute rodeo, as you might expect, every 2 years, short session. And if Texas passes a really high quality package, then you can go to every other red state and say, hey, this is what Texas passed. And that sort of like has a brand, right, to it. And so people have done it with Montana to some degree. The Pacific Northwest has, I think, usually excellent bill writing. Sometimes it's in the weeds and has details that don't export well, but there's a lot of learning and a lot of communication in a way that I don't think it existed at all 5 or 10 years ago.
Is that the Conference of State Legislators? Are you active with?
We sometimes, like, they'll invite people like me to speak at their things, but no, this is advocates talking to advocates and researchers. So this is sort of like advocacy research network. And so advocates all over the country know they can come to Chris or me or lots of other people in this space and say, hey, we want to do a Yes in God's Backyard bill. We heard it was great at the city level in San Diego. How do we do that in our state? And so then we sort of talk through the pros and cons.
And while Salim just said they can come talk to me or Chris, it's really they come talk to Salim, right? Like,
there are a lot of other people.
We have there's a lot of legislator to legislator contact. I'm very regularly on the phone or on Zooms with legislators in other states on housing, on other issues as well, but definitely on housing.
I do think California is different enough than other states that swapping information, but even having a conversation within California, I think is remotely important. Fresno, California is going to be very different than San Jose, California. So being able to understand those regions and talk to the developers that develop in those regions and talking to those city council members, I think there's a lot of communication more communication needs to happen.
And I think this is true nationally, that there's this advocate to advocate and researcher ecosystem. The legislators have their own ecosystem. Getting industry into the conversation is tricky.
Yes.
Because most people in industry, they've got their 1 or 2 projects they're working on. They want to get those done, and if you're going to help them get that project across the finish line, well, great. But they're not that interested in coming in and like blue skying about, well, what if the zoning was completely different than it is? So a lot of my research in the last 2 years has been calling developers on the phone and interviewing them, and land use lawyers and city officials who cover housing, and trying to extract some of this tacit knowledge.
Well, see, this is interesting because it's what forum do you go to get the right information? So
Right.
California Housing Consortium, I sit on their board. It is a completely divided in that it's got as much nonprofit affordable housing developers as for-profit affordable housing developers. And they'll talk to you all day long. And so where do we go? Sometimes it's just about connecting the dots and bringing the right people to the table, because there are trade associations made up of developers who love to talk. And they will tell you they have lists of what needs to be changed. And so how do we bring those practitioners and policymakers and academics all together? Because they're there and they want to talk to you. It's just, I'm not sure how to get that forum together for that to happen.
I mean, I find that in the work that we do, there are certain developers who are just really policy-oriented. There are many developers who are just like, I'm desperate just to like keep my project happening, and but there are other ones who are, they're just very interested in the policy, and they will, and I love it when, whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit, when they come and say, hey, you passed this law, there's this one section that I don't think you intended this way, but this is how it's being interpreted, and that's why we have a lot of cleanup bills every year, because you can never predict how something's going to be interpreted, or how the small number of bad actor cities are going to try to do things in bad faith. We also, there is a whole cadre of land use attorneys who work in many different contexts who are amazing resources, because I also always want to know, I like to have a diverse set of attorney eyes on a bill before we finalize it, to be like, how is this going to play out in the real world? Because they'll sometimes say like, I know what you're intending, and this is going to get totally screwed up in court, and that's extremely helpful.
So let's talk about the politics of housing policy, which I think is just as much as any policy, certainly I've ever worked on, is they're so intertwined. And when I was working in the administration, there was this huge policy and political imperative to do something on the fact that rents were sky high, people couldn't buy a home, homelessness was way up. So all the arrows were pointing in the same direction. Let's do something. And we knew what the solution was. We need to use the levers that we have to make it easier and cheaper to build housing. And we did, I think, some good work. But as a political matter, I don't think it landed in any meaningful way. And I think that makes sense. If you are, putting aside kind of the YIMBY-NIMBY dynamic, just like if you were a renter and your rent went up 20% each of the last 3 years as you've moved apartments, you're not really interested in the president's plan to build millions of more homes over the next decade or streamline permitting or whatever, right? You want your rent to be capped, probably, right? And so I guess I just wonder, maybe Senator, if we want to start with you, and then maybe go to Chris, how you think about that tension. You've shepherded many supply-oriented bills through the legislature at this point. How do you make the case, build a coalition in support of these ideas that are a little longer term?
The politics are so hard because housing it's never fast, or rarely is it fast. And so when we do some of these big bills that are causing all sorts of contentiousness, I think people have this, the people who oppose it have this perception, maybe not explicit, but this perception that the bill gets signed into law and the next day, helicopters arrive, dropping these 6-story, 10-story buildings in their
Good idea, though.
communities. And then and you try to say to them, no, it's going to be gradual. I know, I live in the neighborhood. I live in the Castro, and we had 15 years ago. They upzoned Market Street. They didn't do it enough. It's a lot. It's 6 to 8 story. It should have been 10 to 15 story. But putting that aside, and people were so freaked out about having these, quote unquote, taller buildings there. And now I've lived in that neighborhood 28 years. I don't even remember what it looked like before. They went up very gradually, and it's just it just gets absorbed. But it's slow, and that is a big challenge because it took us 50 years to create this mess, to dig this hole, and it's going to take time to dig out of it. So you have to say to people, trust me. It's going to, over time, I know you're having trouble paying your rent now. I know your kid is about to take your grandkids to Iowa or Colorado because they can't afford to be. I know that's happening now, but just trust me. It's going to be great in the future. And that's why I think we have to focus intensively on the government side of things that we're doing and creating a sense of urgency. But also the private sector, and we have to stop shooting ourselves in the foot. In San Francisco, we have I think about 50,000 homes in mega developments that are approved, some for 10, 15 years, that are not getting built. Why? We approved the Park Merced project. I was it was a super contentious vote, 6-5 vote, to take these dilapidated, falling apart, post-World War II, they were supposed to be temporary homes, and turn them from 1,500 into 6,000 homes. That has not been built because San Francisco does this and other cities do. We put so many financial responsibilities on that developer. They were required to help build a new light rail line. I'm sorry, that is a taxpayer responsibility. That is not the responsibility of the developer. We require them to build parks. We require them to have sometimes affordability components that are way too high. 25-30% affordability in a privately financed development is too high. And if we want it to be that high, we should be putting public money in to buy that affordability. So you have all these projects that are just not penciling. They have to be renegotiated. That's happening now. It's way too slow. And we have to sometimes just get the hell, excuse my language, out of our own way and let people build the housing. And it's very frustrating to me that, but we continue to have this, because I see this in housing bills. Well, we should put these, we want to streamline permits for this housing. Here are the 25 requirements that you have to meet to be able to do that. How about the requirement is that you comply with the building codes and you build homes?
Period.
And so that is, I will also say, it is a Democratic Party thing.
Yeah.
It's a
Amen.
Democratic Party thing, and we just tie ourselves in knots by saying, and we do it in a lot of contexts, saying here are the good things that make the life better, so let's make it easier to do it and stop with the complexity.
I can't agree more than that.
And then I want to get to,
A lot of times it is us getting in our own way. It is regulation on top of regulation on top of regulation. And everybody wants to put their stamp on affordable housing. I'm like, we're trying to get people from under bridges, but you want to make sure it's the greenest building on the street. You want to make sure it has a tot lot and a child care lot, and that it has sustainable gray water going around it. It is just infuriating, but yes, we do too much.
okay.
Good.
Chris?
So 2 comments on the political problem, at least as I see it through some of my research. One, the general public has an appreciation that housing is getting too expensive. They can't afford it. Rents are going up. Home prices are high. But they don't connect the price of housing to the lack of supply of housing. And I've done surveys where we ask people about the effects of supply shocks in labor markets, in agricultural commodity markets, ask people about the effects of free trade agreements, ask people about the effects of big increases in regional supply of housing. For most questions, when you expose people to a supply shock scenario and you ask them to predict what the effect of the supply shock is on prices, they give the answer that an economist would give. When it comes to housing, they don't. And this is not like a kind of supply skepticism that you see in some elite left circles that says, well, if you build new housing, it's going to gentrify the neighborhood and drive up rents nearby. And there's like some like ideological view. It's just confusion. It's just you give people the same question 2 minutes apart or 10 minutes apart, and you get different answers 10 minutes apart. People just don't have a mental model of regional housing markets. And that then creates a political problem, right? If you're trying to build a movement that is appealing to the mass public. The other part of the political problem, the other challenge, is that once housing supply is constrained in a market, then by definition, when there's the possibility of building new housing, there's a surplus that someone can capture. If suddenly the regulations are removed on that parcel of land, the surplus will be captured by the landowner. But then other people are like, well, I want a piece of that too. So then they ask for the affordable housing set aside, or they ask for the union labor requirement, or they ask for any number of other things, a light rail extension, whatever it might be. And the way that process plays out in California now is that we've essentially created a common pool resource, which is the site value of that project. Because it's not like the government is negotiating, like the local government is negotiating with a developer over what the value capture deal is going to be, and they can just reach their deal and then the project can go forward. Rather, anybody who doesn't get their cut or isn't satisfied with their cut can file a lawsuit. They can file a lawsuit under the California Environmental Quality Act. They can file a lawsuit under the state general planning law. And they can delay the project through their lawsuit until they get a settlement that they're happy with. And that creates a dynamic in which it's really, really hard to get housing built at low cost. And it also creates a dynamic where there are a set of interest groups and lawyers who have a lot at stake in the status quo, and don't want to move to a new regime in which housing would be simpler and easier to build, because then they're going to lose their business model, basically, which is negotiating for a small piece of a small pie when we could have just more housing instead.
I think that extortion comes in mostly when there's some kind of public subsidy in it. Because if it's straight private money, you don't get it as much, but you get more. I'm not saying you don't get it, but it happens more often when you have some form of public subsidy. And I'll give you an example. I have a beautiful building in Koreatown in Los Angeles right now. 58 units, perfect model for permanent supportive housing. The total development cost for that development with 58 units was less than $300,000 per unit. It was completely private sector, built by private sector, and now the guy can't get financing because he's running around, and because it's not a traditional model, this would be the perfect opportunity for Project HomeKey or something to come in and help me to finance this development. Less than $300,000 a unit. Now I have a master lease agreement on from the county, but how am I going to permanently finance this development? If it had gone through the tax credits, that exact same project would have been $700,000 a unit. And so that leverage you're talking about, it mostly comes in when you put public money into it.
Okay, quick, and then we'll move to the next one.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of one of the biggest, it might be the biggest political barrier, when there's public discourse in the press and otherwise about we're going to do X for years and years and years, people assume it's all happened already. And so, for example, in San Francisco, we wanted to do safe consumption sites for drug users in San Francisco. It polled at like 80%. This is like 6, 8, 10 years ago. It was talked about for years and years and years and years, trying. We had bills vetoed. It never happened because it never got legalized. But then the polling went south because people just assumed that we had safe consumption sites the whole time, and they failed. We never had them. People have been hearing about all the housing work we're doing all these years, and they just assume, oh, well, that's all being implemented, all being built, and look, housing is still expensive, so it gives opponents the opportunity to say this has failed. Well, not enough housing has been built, and we have this massive hole to dig out of, and when you have a huge hole and you start building, it's not going to be cheap right away. That first tranche is going to still be expensive. And so you have this dysfunctional political dynamic where people are like, you've been talking about this for so long, and it's still expensive because we haven't actually built enough homes.
Okay, so this is flying by, I think. So I'm going to do two kind of lightning round type questions, then we'll move to Q&A from the audience. Okay, so maybe we'll do like 30 seconds each, let's say. So the first is on federal role, which we've only talked about a little bit, which is limited, I think. But lots going on. You know, we've got the reconciliation bill, the House bill that was released earlier this week, which has an expansion of low-income housing tax credit, opportunity zones, which is another tax incentive. You have bills kind of percolating around clawing back highway money and other block grant dollar formula funds for communities that do well or don't do well. So I guess the question, and we have a presidential campaign right around the corner, let's say. So in 2020, next year, we'll see some people announce. What's like one thing you would want a candidate for president to be saying to solve from the federal level to solve our housing crisis? Who wants to? I'm going to pick on Salim since he pointed at the center. Unseemly.
I mean, my attitude is like, keep your federal hands off my state zoning reform. There are a lot of really, wonky federal touch points in housing, and I would love people who work at the federal level to do the work, figure out how, Fannie and Freddie kind of somehow interact with this ecosystem. Great, do that work. Saying, oh, we've read about zoning because we read Ezra and the other Derek's book, and we're going to jump in and do this. Like, I see it. They talk to me. I mostly say, like, keep it real small. Please don't. They can't pass anything, and the messaging could blow up in everyone's face. And so just doing less at the federal level is probably the best way forward, especially since we're winning at the states.
for fear of polarization.
Yeah, for fear of polarization, or just like the federal government messes up everything it touches.
Sure. Yep.
No offense.
Yeah, thank you. Why don't we do Chris, Tia, Senator Wiener?
I think I would not want a candidate for president with a housing platform. I think I'm with Salim on that. I do think there are little technocratic things that can probably be done. I would like the census to collect data on certificates of occupancy, like completed projects, not just building permits. I would like the economists in the federal government to work on scoring local governments on who's doing a good job and who's not doing a good job on housing production relative to potential, and potentially over time, maybe some money gets tied to places that are doing a good job. They get some incentive, some reward. There's the possibility for moving the needle a little bit in big cities. Maybe it's through transportation funding conditionality. Maybe it's through low-income housing tax credit conditionality. I think the politics of housing in big cities are really different than the politics of housing in the suburbs. But I'm generally cautious about anything that involves a presidential candidate making this their agenda.
But you're saying you'd be interested in states taking a more active role and thinking through what levers they have to to pushing localities with discretionary grants.
States?
Like that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, states absolutely. And I think there's some role for the federal government, but I'm worried about polarization and small.
I really like the data information. You cannot make good policy decisions make it an informed decision without the data. And that scares me about this current administration. But Chris's point about data collection and helping to make informed decisions, I think that is a great role for the federal government. One thing that's missing that people don't realize is that a lot of the federal resources that come for housing and community development come directly to local governments. Like they bypass the state, whether it's community development block grant or home funds or Section 8 that's going to the housing authority, those go directly to local government. And so when you cut out all of the community development and planning, that entire department, who's providing that technical assistance to local government? A lot of those funds that we've seen in this particular budget that have gotten wiped out, the staffing at at Department of HUD does not just do housing programs. They do lead abatement. They do community development. They provide technical assistance. And so all of those soft costs, we had the 2 wildfires in Los Angeles here recently. So when you're going from FEMA and you're going from recovery and response, or response and relief to then recovery, those HUD-certified credit counselors who are out there one by one talking to those folks about how to bring them those resources, they've cut all of the HUD-certified counseling funding. So there's no one on the streets talking to these people about recovery. And so the federal government needs to have a role in disaster because their system is completely broken on that. But I have to agree, data sharing, continuing technical assistance with local government, and staying out of the business of zoning.
Yeah, so the nuclear option, which I don't think is going to happen, would be to modernize the Federal Fair Housing Act to make clear what is not fair housing in terms of local land use policies that are designed to perpetuate segregation. That would be a culture war, so I'm not holding my breath on that. I'm always a little skeptical of conditioning funding on land use policies, even though superficially it's tempting. That often ends up hurting poor people who are not the ones who are blocking the housing. When you say, we're going to withhold your public transportation money or this money or that money. Road money is something that like wealthy people care about. So, but I actually think possibly the most significant thing the federal government could do, when I talked about earlier market crafting, is it was the federal government that created Fannie Mae in the 1930s. The federal government created the ability of people to buy homes en masse. That was a creation of the federal government by creating those structures that empowered the private sector to make these loans and have them guaranteed and so forth. And so I think there is an argument to, there seems to be bipartisan support for like well, Trump calls it a sovereign wealth fund, that probably has him as the beneficiary, but like a public, what do you call it, like a public investment bank.
Yep.
Because right now, this boom bust of the construction industry, when we're in a down cycle, let's allow the public sector to come in and make it easy to get financing to build. It keeps your construction workforce employed during the downturn instead of getting rid of them, and it keeps everything going. And I think the federal government could play a huge role in really accelerating construction.
Thank you. Okay, let's do questions. Yes.
Amy Ashton, Executive Director of Palo Alto Ford. My city council member just left, so I can ask any question I want here. So I have a question about fees, and I'm wondering if other cities have done anything innovative around fee collection, because our per unit fee, adjacent here in Palo Alto, I mean, it's $100,000 a unit, pretty close. And our fine city council member would say, but that's how we pay for parks and all our services, and how do we make our community wonderful if we can't collect these fees? What other ideas are floating out there? Are there other solutions? How can we take this weight off of housing?
Split roll.
Amen. Fix Prop 13. Yeah.
All right, I like the efficient. Can we get is there a student?
Short of that, parcel taxes.
Is there a student that wants to? Sure, why don't we go with you?
Hi, I'm Sahir. I'm a student in the Public Policy Department. I'm curious about the cyclical nature of housing development and whether you all think that it's that subsidizing private development or like through low interest loans, for example, is solely something that the federal government should do, or whether there's a role in like high interest periods.
I mean, I think the state could do it as well, but the federal government is uniquely equipped, it has the tools and in terms of how its budget works. And the harm that was done in the Great Recession, the construction industry was basically liquidated. And it took about 10 years to get back. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. So I think having that counter-cyclical investment is incredibly important.
A lot of it is time is money. And so if you got rid of the time that it takes to build, you wouldn't necessarily need some of that subsidy. But it just takes so much time to just get, whether it's a market rate development or an affordable development, the time that it takes to get through is just, the cost it's cost prohibitive.
Others? Let's do you, and then in the blue. Yep.
Can I actually ask 2 questions?
Yeah, we're tight on time, so just quickly, yeah.
My first question is, I know housing is a complex problem, but I want to ask y'all to simplify. And if you had to say just one line of wisdom about either the problem or the solution, what would that line be?
That's impossible to answer.
Everybody needs a place to put their head at night.
We don't have enough homes, and we need to build every single kind of housing.
Housing at every spectrum, from homelessness to home ownership.
I don't have a one-liner.
Academic, you know.
And then my second question, y'all at different points talked about how part of the issue is different people not having conversations together and just not being connected. And so it's a statement, not a question. I want to challenge y'all to think about how y'all can stay connected after this and continue to have conversations beyond just this one event.
Great, thank you. We'll do a panel reunion every quarter or so. Yeah, right here, and then I think I saw one up front. Okay, great.
Pass this over, please.
This is a question for Chris and Scott. You guys represent exactly the area that I'm thinking about, Davis and San Francisco, the Bay Area. Imagine if you could buy a house, brand new, for 35% of the cost, and you'd have 75% more square feet. Would that be a pretty good housing opportunity? Well, it turns out that That's exactly what exists between the counties of Solano, Yolo, and Sacramento, and the Bay Area. In the Bay Area, 1,100 square foot home goes for $2 million and it's 70 years old. In those counties, particularly around Sacramento, you can buy a 1,900 square foot home for about $600,000, $700,000 and it's brand new. So what's our strategy for regionalizing tech merely 2 hours away and having them build satellite campuses there, reducing pressure on the Bay Area and giving boatloads of affordable new housing opportunities? If we don't do that, cities like Austin and Boulder will.
I've never been a fan of the idea of let's push jobs away from a particular area. I don't think that's ever been a successful strategy. And I think in the Bay Area we've seen that we've had a real flight of jobs, and it's causing huge economic problems in the Bay Area. And so I don't think that saying, hey, you should move jobs away is the answer. I think people are where they are. People make decisions about where to be, and we should make sure that we have enough housing and that's how the human beings have done it forever. People go to a certain area, an area starts growing, so you build more housing for it. You don't say, you go work over there instead. No, it's like, you're here, so we're going to build housing for you. That's my take.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's big technological, economic changes that result in regions rising, regions falling. There's a reason why a lot of people want to be in the Bay Area. We should accommodate that, just like there was once upon a time a reason a lot of people wanted to be in St. Louis. And when the Mississippi River was super important for shipping, St. Louis boomed. Now it's not so important for shipping, so St. Louis shrinks. That's how we should try to accommodate things as best we can.
Thank you.
I can just project if that's easier.
There's a
We got
live stream.
recording. Thanks. I'm Langston. I'm a senior in urban studies and public policy here. And I'm from the East Bay, where the home of inclusionary zoning is. And that's something that we haven't really talked about that much tonight. I'm thinking about your comments, Senator, around kind of the sandbagging of some inclusionary zoning policies, about 30 to 50% affordability rates. But I also know that's a key part of your SB 35, which is one of the most impactful pieces of housing legislation. I'm curious about where you all see the role of inclusionary zoning going forward.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've supported inclusionary housing requirements, but you have to hit the sweet spot of what's the percentage that will maximize the amount of housing. Because if you go above it, and if it makes the project not feasible, then you get zero. And SB 35. We have the two tiers, the 10% and the 50%. There's a whole convoluted reason that I'm not going to get into, moderator will kill me, about why that 50% exists. It was not setting at 50% inclusionary. It was a different issue. That 50%, it doesn't work. There are bespoke projects that may, but that's not a viable, large-scale, sustainable strategy. And so a lot of times the debate about inclusionary ends up being, I like that 25% that sounds nice, or you have a debate should be 20 or 25. It's about doing the economic analysis of what's going to produce the most amount of housing overall and the highest number of inclusionary units.
Yeah, agree. Great. Well, I think we are just about at time, so please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you.